Everyone, what's up and welcome back to another episode here of the Crushing Small Stakes PLO course. Today we're going to continue our pursuit on becoming better at low stakes. We have been talking a lot about pre-flop, post-flop, play and explains, member reviews, etc. And today we're going to jump again into a pre-flop situation. Today the topic will be squeezing, and let's jump right into it on what the topic especially will be. The setup of today will be a race from the cutoff. There is a bottom player who decides to cold call and we are sitting in the small blind. In a GTO setting here, a squeezing frequency of the small blind would be 7.2%. We're going to look into what this 7.2% consists of, what hand belong into there, and also how should we adjust if the initial raiser, so in this situation the cutoff, is not folding very often or never versus a squeeze. First things first, here is the GTO overview of the small blinds strategy. You can see all the strength buckets that we're utilizing, the 18 categories. You can pause the video if you want to look deeper into it. And also after the video, of course, make sure to use the PLO trainer to create this setup yourself, jump into there, and then learn more about our GTO frequencies. That being said, I'm not going to specifically break down this chart that you're seeing here, but I'm going to highlight a couple of interesting takeaways from this graph. First of all, let's look into the Broadway pairs. When we look into Broadway pairs, remember, we're not talking about aces here because aces are always being squeezed here, basically. When we look into Broadway pairs that are double suited, you can see that these hands are being squeezed 64% and single suited or rainbow versions are only squeezed 16%. So there's the first big difference already. When we separate a little bit larger, you can see that kings that are double suited are always being squeezed in this situation. When we look into the single suited kings, we can see that single suited kings are 58% of the time being squeezed. And the kings that we're using to squeeze here, they must have an ace, they should be double paired, or they must be extremely well connected. The ace and the double paired combinations when being single suited are pretty obvious, but let's look at some examples of the last category, the connected ones. For example, king 6-5 is fine enough to squeeze here. Also a hand like king 10-8 with the 10-eye suit in this situation is good enough to come in for the squeeze. But remember, this is the bottom of our squeezing range sort of with the kings. Any hand that is better should also be included there. Rainbow versions, only 5% of the kings are being squeezed here. And for example, a hand like king 10-10, rainbow is fine enough to come in for the squeeze, but it's an extremely low frequency. There are only a couple of hands, so it's not something we should worry about too much. Let's look into the queens here. Double suited queens, 80% of the time we are squeezing. You can see it's already a little bit less than with kings, which were 100% of the time squeeze. With double suited queens, we are looking at the best ones, or at least let's put it the other way around. Like we're squeezing 80% of them. We're basically not squeezing the ones that are the most disconnected. I had like queen 8 deuce, queen 9 3, those type of queens we don't really want to squeeze, but the other combinations are all fine enough to come in for the squeeze here when double suited. Single suited, there is a massive drop going to 13%. Here we must be extremely well connected and we must have 4 high cards in our hand. So there's a massive drop and also a big difference when it comes to playing kings versus queens. Some examples here should be ace, queen 8 with the nut suit here and the 8 that is connected there. And also queen 10-9, single suited to the queen here is good enough to come in for the squeeze. But it's, as you can see here, it's important to have that strong connectivity. The ace, queen 8 example. Another combination would be ace, queen 10, for example, with the queen high suit. That hand would also be fine enough to come in for the squeeze because the 10 is better connected. So then we don't necessarily have to have the nut suit. But with the nut suit, like ace, queen 8 is sort of the bottom of our squeezing range here. Rainbow versions, we're not squeezing them. Let's look at jacks and 10s here. When double suited, already again a massive drop. Now only 42% of them are being squeezed. We must have an ace in our hand. We must be double paired or extremely well connected here to consider squeezing with these type of hands. Single suited, jacks and 10s, 5% of the time only. We must have an ace that is suited to the ace in our hand. and we must be extremely well connected, and the best double paired are also fine. For example, ace 10 10 9, we have the nut suit, we have connection with the 9 10 combination, and we're blocking the ace, so that's fine. Also combination 10 10 8 8, single suited the double paired hand, which is one of the best ones with the tens we can have. That is totally fine here. Okay, let's move, before we're going to move on, sorry, we got the rainbow version here also, of course, we're never squeezing them. Double suited rundowns, let's look at them. What are type of combinations here are we squeezing? We're first going to look into the 0, 1, and 2 gappers, which is one of the categories. You can see it on the top right. If we do have a double suited rundown with either of these combinations, with either of these amount of gaps, if we do have an ace, we're always squeezing. If we don't have an ace, we're squeezing 45% of the time. Now let's look a little bit deeper into that second subgroup of hands. The frequencies here, if we have 0 gaps and we also don't have an ace, of course, we're squeezing 78% of the time, 1 gap 77% of the time, and 2 gaps 19%. So in my opinion, the biggest takeaways here is like 0 gaps and 1 gaps, we are basically always squeezing or extremely often squeezing. 2 gaps, we're almost never squeezing. Let's look a little bit deeper into it because there are a few takeaways here that are important to remember here and to remind ourselves of. 0 gaps and 1 gaps, you're going to squeeze with the bottom hands, which are like 7 6 5 3, 7 6 5 4. Like this is the absolute bottom. We're not squeezing 6 high and 5 high double suited rundowns. That is way too loose and way too marginal. But this combination in a GTO setting would still be okay. If you look into the 2 gappers, you already know here, seeing on the left side, it's only 19%. And here we look at only the ones with high cards that are basically the strongest and have the highest suits here. A hand like Queen 10 9 7 double suited or King 10 9 8 double suited is fine enough. But if you don't have a king or a queen in your hand, then any of these 2 gaps are never being a squeeze here. So also these 10 high rundowns with the 2 gaps or jack high rundowns with 2 gaps, like you just don't want to squeeze them. 3 Broadway cards and 1 non-Broadway card. Again, on the top right, you can see a short summary here. If you do have an ace here, 87% of the time you're squeezing. Without an ace, there's never squeezing, almost like 4%. So here I would say simplify it to always squeeze with an ace, never squeeze without an ace. I think that's totally fine. Here we're thinking about hands like ace, queen, ace, king, queen, 5 double suited, for example. That hand would always be squeeze here. Ace, queen, 10, 7 double suited, like those hands belong into this category. But if you don't have an ace in your hand, so for example, king, queen, jack, 7, king, queen, jack, 6, those type of hands, if you have multiple gaps in there, just fold them. They are not strong enough to come in for the squeeze here. 2 Broadways and 2 low connectors here in this situation. Let's look at what we're looking at here. You can see with the ace, 52% of the time we are squeezing. Without an ace, there's only a 7% squeeze looking into this category. So again, the ace is a very important asset in our hand. The strategy here, it highly prefers not having a deuce or a 3 in our hand. And it also doesn't really like to have a 4 or a 5 in there, a little bit more, because there are some strong combinations that could be fine. For example, ace, king, 5, 4, ace, king, 6, 5, ace, queen, 6, 5, those type of hands, they are good enough to squeeze. But in general, all these wheel cards, they don't really play well as a squeeze. Without a wheel card, basically most hands are being utilized as a squeeze unless they are extremely disconnected. But hands like ace, 10, 7, 6, ace, queen, 9, 8 double suited, like these hands are very good squeezes here. Important takeaways here, we don't want to have those wheel cards, and without wheel cards, we're going to squeeze aggressively. Now let's look at some adjustments we want to make if our opponent doesn't like to fold or never folds. So before we're going to move into that, so far we've been looking into GTO setups, squeezing that 7.2%, but we're going to now look at how we should adjust. As mentioned, I didn't recall every category of hand before. I don't think that's necessary. I highlighted a few important takeaways. But I want you to jump into the PLO trainer yourself, open up this spot, and then train it yourself. Use these strength buckets to open them up, break them down, and get a better understanding. There's no point in me doing all that work for you. I'm going to highlight the most important takeaways, and then it's up to yourself to start training, to start understanding more about these rangers. Adjustments here. Let's look a little bit closer into this. So in a GTO setting, the cutoff is supposed to fold 60% of the time. So the cutoff raises the button calls, we squeeze from the small blind, and here the cutoff should fold at low stakes, PLO 50, 60%, which makes us want to squeeze 7.2% of the time. Now, if we make the cutoff fold only half of those hands, 30%, our squeeze frequency would drop to 6.2%. I looked into population tendencies, and the average number the population is folding here is around 30%. So that middle number is somewhat accurate for what we should look out for, what you should think about. But there are, of course, also a lot of players that either do have a high fold frequency, for example, 40, 50, 60%, so where we can utilize the GTO outcomes. But there are also many players who never fold, basically. And there we can use like the bottom one more. Versus a 0% cutoff fold, the squeeze frequency drops to 5.7%. So you can see here a drop off going from 7.2 to 6.2 to 5.7. The adjustments here that we are making after looking into this data: squeeze less when the initial raiser has a low fold or no fold versus squeeze. And some hands can now go into our cold calling range. Some hands, we don't want to squeeze them anymore because they benefit so much from fold equity if squeezed. But some of these hands are still good enough to enter the pot. There's already a small blind in there. There's a lot of dead money in there. And we can definitely get away with entering the pot with some of these hands if we're not squeezing anymore. Especially if you have a high pair with a high suit. Some of those combinations that don't really want to squeeze anymore, they can still enter the pot by calling. Some connected hands that do have that nut suit, but that don't really want to squeeze anymore at this point, can also enter the pot. And exploitatively, of course, think about if you have a very passive big blind behind you that never gonna squeeze, if you have some recreational players opening in front of you, there are, of course, always reasons to enter the pot a little bit lighter here. Okay, let's look into some more adjustments here before we're gonna wrap up this session of today. High pairs. With high pairs, it's extremely important to become more connected when your opponents fold less. We already saw something similar also in the versus 3-bet situation, or where we did adjust our 3-bet strategy. And here we see very similar outcomes again in a way. Like connectivity becomes more important, high suits become more important, and occasionally we want to flat some of the weakest aces instead of going for the squeeze, because even those hands, they benefit occasionally from fold equity, especially like the weakest rainbow ones. So these are some adjustments we want to make versus a low fold, no fold if we think about high pairs. If we think about the double suited rundowns that we've looked into before, we can see that the bottom of our GTO squeeze is now often being a call or a fold. It's either a mix or leaning more towards calling. But especially like these 8 high, these 7 high rundowns, like they don't want to squeeze anymore. Connectivity and high suits become crucial here. And also make sure that all 4 cards work together. So for example, with a group of hands that has like those 3 Broadway cards and a 4th side card, like it becomes more important that that 4th side card has an actual function to it. So these are some of the summaries from adjustments that we want to make, looking into high pairs, double suited rundowns. And by now, I'm also going to wrap up this session of today, looking into GTO squeezing frequencies, knowing more about what hands should be in there. We also learned a little bit more about how we want to adjust. We want to squeeze tighter. There are a few takeaways here that you see on the screen now. I'm going to upload this file for the PLO trainer below the episode so you can download it and also train yourself more about what hands do belong in there when you are talking about facing a no fold versus squeeze or a low fold versus squeeze. As mentioned, I also recommend you to check out the PLO trainer and learn more about the GTO frequencies, because it's always good to have a good understanding of that 7.2%, and then think and learn more about what hands do we want to cut out when it comes to a 6% squeezing range, for example. Okay, that's going to be it, guys. Hope you enjoyed this one. Again, any questions, make sure to use the comment section below. My name is Luke for the PLO Mastermind. I will see you next week here with another episode for the Crushing Small Stakes PLO course. Bye-bye.